What does it mean to be you? What does it mean to have a specific, conscious experience of the world around you, and yourself within it? Historically, humanity has considered the nature of consciousness to be a primarily spiritual or philosophical inquiry. But scientific research is now mapping out compelling biological theories and explanations for consciousness and selfhood.
Don, 1979, 1980, you and I were both at MIT getting involved in brains and consciousness.
Yes.
So after all this time, you tell me what you think consciousness is.
Well, my views are a bit unusual. I think that consciousness is fundamental in the universe. I think that it's not a product of space and time or anything inside space and time. I think that efforts to derive consciousness from space-time, either by identity theories or by causal theories, have proven ineffective. And I've been forced to take the view that consciousness is actually fundamental in the universe.
Well, everybody who we worked with, every neuroscientist at MIT then and now, would believe that consciousness is a product of our brain, and our brain is an accidental product of evolution, and we have emerged to have consciousness for some fitness reason, and that's all it is. It may not have been necessary, and we have it, and the reason we think it's important is because we have it and we're asking the question.
Well, I think the evidence for evolution is quite strong, so I don't question evolution, but no one's been able to give a theory about how consciousness could emerge from brain activity. And I have to admit that I've tried myself for a long time to understand how brain activity could cause...
Well, what is it about consciousness that causes you to make such a radical departure from everyone normal?
Well, of course, I'm not the only one in the field that thinks that the problem is hard. So it's quite common to think that the problem is very, very hard. And my departure from a physicalist attempt is partly, there's a couple of reasons. One is it's a good search strategy. If you're trying to solve a problem and everybody's searching in one part of the search space, if 99% of the researchers are in one part of the search space, that's not an effective search strategy.
Okay, well,
we need to have at least one or two researchers that are searching in a different part of the search space. And so I decided to jump out and look over in the consciousness is fundamental space.
Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to this Medical Center Hour. This is a program entitled Is There Life After Death? 50 Years of Research at UVA. 50 years ago this year in 1967, Dr. Ian Stevenson, then chair of UVA's Department of Psychiatry, created within the department a research unit, now known as the Division of Perceptual Studies, to study what, if anything, of the human personality survives after death. Dr. Stevenson's own research investigated hundreds of accounts of young children who claimed to recall past lives.
I personally think one of the most important areas that we touched upon is what Bruce was talking about, near-death experiences, and in particular those that occur under extreme physiological conditions such as cardiac arrest and deep general anesthesia. And that's because there is a very strong consensus in contemporary neuroscience about what the conditions are that are required for conscious experience. And here we have cases in which those conditions have been abolished or very seriously degraded, and yet people are not only having experiences, but the most intense and important experiences they ever had in their whole lives. Psi even figures into some of this work because a key feature is the ability to show that the experience was occurring at the time the person was out, because the person can report something that happened during that time that he would have no means of knowing about. We also talk about stuff like extreme forms of genius and mystical experiences. Mystical experiences, they're hardly talked about at all in the contemporary science literature, and to the extent they are, it's mostly to be pathologized or, ignored. Now, all these things together lead to a picture of how mind and brain work together. And so the picture that arises is one in which the mind is inherently something much bigger than we customarily know about. Our everyday consciousness arises from the interaction of that larger something with the brain as it's going through its ordinary activities. That if you take the existence of these various rogue phenomena seriously and attempt to figure out how things must be in order for them to happen, we believe you are driven inexorably into metaphysical territory shared with the world's great traditional faiths. That doesn't mean it endorses any particular one of them in all details, but that they have certain things in common. And in particular, the idea that seems to be emerging most forcefully is that, contrary to the recent spate of attacks on all things religious from representatives of classical physicalism, there is at the heart of reality some kind of enormous conscious something that we are somehow connected with in the deepest parts of our being, that is expressing itself through the evolution of the whole world as we experience it. And I think, we have 50 years of accomplishment behind ourselves. We've got our conceptual and technical and practical situation pretty well in hand, and we hope you'll all be with us as we try to carry the whole subject further in whatever ways you can. Thank you.
The reason that I'm wanting to talk to you on this topic, even though it's not strictly speaking psychiatry, and even though it's such a theoretical paper, is because I'm terribly excited about it. I really believe, if you will forgive me, that we are pretty close to cracking what is called the hard problem of consciousness. And this is supposed to be the most difficult problem in science today, summary. And I'll start now with the first point, the hard problem. What is the hard problem? Well, it was formulated in a journal. In fact, this journal, the one at the top there, the Journal of Consciousness Studies, which is why we published our paper there. It was published by a philosopher named David Chalmers, and this is what he wrote.
The hard problem of consciousness is the problem of how physical processes in the brain give rise to the subjective experience of the mind and of the world. If you look at the brain from the outside, you see this extraordinary machine, an organ consisting of 84 billion neurons that fire in synchrony with each other. When I see, visual inputs come to my eyes, photons hit my eyes, they send a signal that goes up the optic nerve to the back of my brain. It sends neural firings propagating throughout my brain, and eventually I might produce an action. From the outside, though, I look like a complicated mechanism, a robot. This is how science might describe me from the objective point of view. But there's also a subjective point of view. There's what it feels like for the agent who is seeing the scene. When I see you, I see colors, I see shapes, I have an experience from a first-person point of view. There's something it's like to be me. And this is the conscious experience of seeing. It's part of the inner movie of the mind. This inner movie has many, many dimensions. It has the dimension of vision, it has the dimension of sound, like a normal movie, but it also has touch and taste and smell. It has emotions, it has thought, it has a sense of one's body. All of this is subjective experience. And it's one of the most familiar facts in the world that we have this subjective experience. But it's also one of the most mysterious. Why is it that these physical processes in the brain should produce subjective experience? Why doesn't it go on in the dark without any consciousness at all? No one right now knows the answer to this question. So in the science and philosophy of consciousness, people use the word consciousness for many different things, and some of the things are easier to explain than other things. So sometimes I like to distinguish between the easy problems of consciousness and the hard problem. The easy problems are not really so easy. They're as difficult as most problems in science, but it's the hard problem that's really the mystery. So the hard problem, by contrast, is the problem of how it is that all these processes give rise to subjective experience. And what's distinctive about this is it doesn't seem to be a problem about objective mechanisms, about, for example, behaviors that the brain produces. We could tell a complete story about the objective mechanisms in the brains, the neurons that fire, the behaviors they produce, and so on, explaining all these functions, awakeness, responsiveness, discrimination, monitoring. And there might still be a further question. Why is all that associated with subjective experience?
Max, for the last half century, I've been focusing on consciousness. I did my doctorate in neuroscience, and the assumption is that physics, sure, was the underpinning of the chemistry and the biochemistry and the cellular structure, but we didn't have to worry about that or even think about it to understand the nature of consciousness. That has changed recently. Why so? Why is the physics of consciousness particularly important?
I feel that it's changed because we've come to realize that a large fraction of the things we're stuck on in physics, of the unsolved mysteries, actually have to do with what it means to be an observer. And if you take, for example, the biggest embarrassment of all, that we can't unify general relativity, the theory of the big, with quantum mechanics, the theory of the small, these two theories have the exact opposite definition of observer. General relativity says that an observer is this infinitesimally tiny thing with no mass and having no effect on its environment.
A point, yeah.
Yeah, whereas quantum mechanics says that the observer has an effect on that which is observed. So no wonder we can't unify them. And there are a lot of other problems too, where if you trace back, in my opinion, where the rub lies, it's in the fact that we've tried to avoid talking about what an observer is, even though physics is supposed to be the subject of observation, which is ridiculous. There's been this kind of prejudice that consciousness is just a bunch of flaky hooey that physicists shouldn't talk about, and that we could somehow get away with not talking about it. And I think we have to face up to the fact now that no, especially if you believe that I am made of quarks and electrons and physical things, I can't sweep under the rug the fact that I am an observer, and if I want to know what observers see, I have to understand the relationship between quarks and electrons and this subjective...
So this inner feeling that we have, which seems so remarkable. So how can physics then recursively explain consciousness?
Because it forces us into making the question a little bit easier. If you take the famous hard problem of consciousness as you articulated, namely, why is it that this quark blob has a subjective experience? That feels very hard, but if you take as a starting point that some quark blobs like this one have a subjective experience and other ones like this table don't, then this transforms the hard problem into this hard fact that some quark blobs are conscious, some aren't. So there must be some physical principle, some equation, which tells you which things are conscious and which aren't. And this becomes now an experimental question. You can put me in our magnetoencephalography scanner at MIT and measure information processing in my head, and I can have a computer program that shows me in real time whether I'm thinking about a strawberry or a chair on a computer screen. And I also know subjectively what I'm thinking about, so I can check if that's correct or not, and then I can start to say, well, okay, the computer has this particular part of the information processing in my brain that I'm conscious of, the computer sees, but the computer also sees some information processing that I'm not conscious about, like my heartbeat regulation. So what principle is it that distinguishes conscious from unconscious information processing? And I'm convinced, this is a controversial point of view, but I'm convinced that there is some principle, some equation that determines which kinds of information processing are conscious and which aren't. And I would love to find it.
It's just a different kind of question. Like, ultimately, it's a question for science.
The currently most popular mathematical approach to consciousness is integrated information theory, IIT for short. It was put forward by a neurologist, Giulio Tonini, in 2004. In IIT, each system is assigned a number, that's big phi, which is the integrated information and supposedly a measure of consciousness. The better a system is at distributing information while it's processing the information, the larger phi. A system that's fragmented and has many parts that calculate in isolation may process lots of information, but this information is not integrated, so phi is small. For example, a digital camera has millions of light receptors. It processes large amounts of information, but the parts of the system don't work much together, so phi is small. The human brain, on the other hand, is very well connected and neural impulses constantly travel from one part to another. So phi is large. Another topic that received a lot of attention is the idea by Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff that consciousness arises from quantum effects in the human brain, not in synapses, but in microtubules. What the heck are microtubules? Microtubules are tiny tubes made of proteins that are present in most cells, including neurons. According to Penrose and Hameroff, in the brain, these microtubules can enter coherent quantum states which collapse every once in a while, and consciousness is created in that collapse. Most physicists, me included, are not terribly excited about this idea because it's generally hard to create coherent quantum states of fairly large molecules, and it doesn't help if you put these molecules into a warm and wiggly environment like the human brain. For the Penrose and Hameroff conjecture to work, the quantum state would have to survive at least a microsecond or so. But the physicist Max Tegmark has estimated that they would last more like a femtosecond, that's only 10 to the minus 15 seconds. Penrose and Hameroff are not the only ones who pursue the idea that quantum mechanics has something to do with consciousness.
If a tree falls in a forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? An age-old philosophical question, you might think. But in fact, this question was given a decisive answer in the 17th century by the father of modern science, Galileo. So what did he do? Well, Galileo got around this by proposing a radically new philosophical theory of reality. So we think of Galileo as a great experimental scientist, which of course he was, but he was also a great philosopher. So he proposed this theory, and according to this new philosophical theory, the qualities aren't really out there in the physical world, rather they are in the consciousness of the observer. So if there's someone looking at a tomato, the redness isn't really out there on the surface of the tomato, rather it's in the consciousness of the person observing it. Or if someone's eating paprika, the spiciness isn't really inside the paprika, it's rather in the
four people here. Yeah.
Thank you. What you say, which is very interesting, is very similar to what George Berkeley said, as you probably are aware, in the 18th century. There is a question to which he answered in two different ways, so I'm really curious about how you would answer to this. The question that his contemporary asked him about the tree in the forest that nobody is perceiving. So what kind of existence does it have?
Let me answer also a question you didn't ask, but which was nice in your introduction. I will answer that in a second. Berkeley was an idealist, probably the first major famous idealist. I feel compelled to label myself as an idealist. No, in other words, somebody who believes that only the reality of mentality exists, nothing outside of subjective experience, for the mere reason that materialists invented a concept of a world outside of mind, a world outside of consciousness. If they hadn't invented that, I wouldn't need the word mind. It's just what there is.
First, I want to congratulate you on your elegant simplicity.
Thank you.
And then I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about the relationship between self-localization and non-locality of the whole. You understand the question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just.
there has to be a mechanism in the self-localization process to make us, quote, unconscious of everything that's going on, because I am postulating that everything is going on in the same mind. So in principle, we should all have extrasensory perception of everything that is happening across space, time, and beyond. We don't. So there is something that is going on there. I do not have the time to get into that because it's the most complex part of my argument. It's in the book, but it's not in this presentation. But I would just suggest, very brief, it will not be satisfying, but it will give you a line of thought. When you look up to the sky at noon, you only see blue, you don't see the stars. But the stars are still there. The photons from the stars are still hitting your retina, just as they would at night. At night you would see them all, at noon you don't, but they are all still there, and the light is still hitting your retina. It's just that they are obfuscated by a much stronger source of light, namely the sun refracting on the atmosphere. In my mind, there is no unconscious, there is only egoic obfuscation. So non-locality is with us all the time, but it's obfuscated because in the middle of that whirlpool, there is a self-referential process going on that amplifies the context of egoic awareness and obfuscates everything else, just like the stars at noon. It's all still there, but we are so taken by this loop of egoic awareness that amplifies mental contents that you become aware that you're aware, that you're aware, that you're aware of something, that everything else is obfuscated. I don't have time to
But it's a question which right now our scientific methods don't have a very good handle on. So at least for now, it's a central question for philosophy. Now philosophy has a great history of turning its questions into science. Many of the great sciences started as areas of philosophy. Physics was originally part of philosophy until Newton developed his physical theories in the 17th century. Once he figured out how to solve it, then it became a science. Something similar happens with linguistics and psychology and economics. I would like eventually consciousness to turn into a problem for science. But first of all, philosophy needs to do its work with this problem to make it tractable. Right now, we're just in the stage where philosophy and science are cooperating. In terms of the brain, you'll get a good solution to the easy problems, to the various behaviors, and so on, but you'll never get a full solution to the hard problem. And the fundamental principles that connect brain processes to consciousness. Right now, we don't know what those fundamental principles might be. There are some ideas. This does raise many of the traditional aspects of the philosophical mind-body problem. What is the place of consciousness in the physical world, and how does it exert a causal role? Is consciousness something separate from all the brain processes that exert some effect on the brain, as many of the traditional dualists say? The view I'm attracted to is that consciousness is actually present at a fundamental level, inside the brain and inside all physical processes. This is the traditional philosophical view known as panpsychism, that maybe all of physics involves some element of consciousness at the basic level. Somehow all of this composes to yield my consciousness. It's a beautiful, unified, attractive view of the world where consciousness and the physical world might be integrated all the way down. The big problem for this view is, again, another version of the hard problem, but now in the version, how can these small bits of consciousness at the fundamental level add up to the kind of single, unified conscious experience that I have? People call this the combination problem. How do the atoms of consciousness combine to yield human consciousness? Nobody right now has a solution to that problem. But
it's undeniable that some organisms are subjects of experience. But the question of how it is that these systems are subjects of experience is perplexing. Why is it that when our cognitive systems engage in visual and auditory information processing, we have visual or auditory experience? The quality of deep blue, the sensation of middle sea. How can we explain why there's something it's like to entertain a mental image or experience an emotion? It's widely agreed that experience arises from a physical basis, but we have no good explanation of how and why it so arises. And there you have that how and why, which gives me my title. So there's the hard problem as formulated by David Chalmers in 1995. This question open. Why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner feel? And this relates to the whole argument about philosophical zombies and so on, that you can have a machine that performs all the functions, a computerized machine, there's Turing machines that perform all the functions of human cognition and pretty darn well, and increasingly these days pretty much better than us in many respects, and they're not conscious. So what does the consciousness add? The consciousness is something which isn't accounted for by the explanation of the function. The function can be performed without consciousness. This is what Chalmers is saying. And I think that there's merit to that view if you think about this fourth point, which is, in fact, cognition is not intrinsically conscious. A major discovery of the last 20 years of the 20th century, or rediscovery, if you'll forgive me for putting it that, bearing in mind I'm a psychoanalyst, was that most of our mental functions are in fact performed unconsciously. And most of cognition does not require consciousness. In fact, when you look at how much we can do unconsciously in regard to cognition, it really has led seriously to the question, what on earth is the consciousness for? Because it's not clear what it adds. It's not clear that it does anything. And I'm speaking about memory and language and navigation, problem solving, all sorts of things can be done, even reading with comprehension, even recognizing a familiar face and so on. It's easy to demonstrate experimentally that all of these cognitive and cortical functions can be performed brilliantly without the experimental subject even knowing that they have experienced anything. Here's a famous review paper by Barge and Chartrand from your great city, The Unbearable Automaticity of Being, where they review the literature, the cognitive science literature, showing how our cognition is basically automatic, that it all runs its course without us necessarily having to be there. And the most famous example probably is Benjamin Libet's studies, where he showed that even the celebrated free will, the decision to perform an action, is in fact preceded by cortical activity long before, 300 milliseconds before you think that you've come to the conscious decision to do this. So this leads me to my next point, which is that I agree with Chalmers that we can't, it is puzzling looking for the function of consciousness in relation, if our model example is a cognitive form of consciousness, and by the way, the model example in consciousness studies has been vision. The main focus has been since Crick's time on vision. Let's try and understand what's going on in the cortex when you're having conscious vision versus non-conscious vision, and then the difference between the two is the so-called neural correlate of consciousness, and then let's drill down into that, and then we'll understand what consciousness does, what it's for, and how it works, and it has been singularly unsuccessful. And I say again, the reason for that is because cognition is not an intrinsically conscious function, and cortex is not intrinsically conscious. So we're looking in the wrong place. We're looking at the wrong type of mental functioning. If we're wanting to understand consciousness, we should in fact rather be looking at affect than cognition. And here's the one mention of Freud. Freud, I thought, was best person to quote in this regard, because he is, as I said, famously responsible for making us aware of how much of our mental life is unconscious, and yet even Freud says the following: it's surely of the essence of an emotion that we should be aware of it. That is, that it should become known to consciousness. Thus, the possibility of the attribute of unconsciousness would be completely excluded as far as emotions, feelings, and affects are concerned. Now, this is not an appeal to authority. I'm just wanting to make you aware that even Freud was of the view. I could have appealed to the Oxford English Dictionary. By definition, a feeling is felt. It makes absolutely no sense to speak of this mental function called feeling without reference to consciousness. So if you're wanting to understand the elemental form, the foundational form, the basic form of consciousness, start with those mental functions which are intrinsically conscious. Don't start with those that are intrinsically unconscious. You're going to get lost. So I say this is where we start to cast an entirely different light on the problem. I think that it's entirely reasonable to ask the question, what is the function of affect? Because the function of affect has to explain why it feels like something, unlike vision and cognition in general, which, as I say, does not necessarily have to feel like something. Feelings do have to feel like something. Everything that feelings do, they do because you feel them. So here's a slide just to remind you of something of the history of how we got this problem wrong. We thought of cortex as the organ of consciousness. This comes from classical German functional neuroanatomy of the 19th century. We thought of consciousness as streaming in through our senses, which project ultimately onto cortex. Cortex is where all of our sensory qualities reside, and so this was thought of as the organ of consciousness. If you lesion visual cortex, you lose visual consciousness. If you lesion auditory cortex, you lose auditory consciousness, and so on. But in fact, as I showed you with the hydranencephalic kids, and in fact decorticate animals, you see the same thing. You can remove the whole of cortex, and the animal remains conscious and emotionally responsive, as do human beings.
I think the definition is very simple, and we're not going to come up with a consensus definition that everybody automatically agrees with. But what I want to do is give an intuitive definition, just so we don't talk past each other, that we can start off at least on the same page. And for me, consciousness is any kind of subjective experience whatsoever. It's not the same as intelligence. It's not the same as language. It's not the same as the experience of being a self. It's any experience, whether it's pain, pleasure, a thought, an emotion, a feeling of intention. These are all aspects of consciousness. Now, a little bit more formally, I always prefer to start with the definition of the philosopher Thomas Nagel. And his definition of consciousness, which goes back to the 1970s, is that an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something it is like to be that organism. If it feels like something to be that organism, it feels like something to be me, it feels like something to be each one of you. It probably feels like something to be a bat. As Thomas Nagel's famous paper said, for those of you who know it, what is it like to be a bat? We humans don't know, we can't experience the inner universe of a bat, but for the bat, it feels like something to be that bat. And the same for probably many other animals too. But there is probably nothing it feels like to be a stapler or a table or even an iPhone. It's a mechanism, a complex mechanism, but it doesn't feel like anything to be that complex mechanism. That's the broadest definition of consciousness. Consciousness and life are not the same thing. One of the methodologically, the big difference between trying to understand a living system and trying to understand consciousness is that you can put a living system on a table or on a lab bench and all look at it and all agree about what the data are. You can agree about what's going on. But a conscious experience is intrinsically private and subjective. I can describe my conscious experiences, but that's not the same as you having direct access to what I'm experiencing. You cannot put a conscious experience on the table and look at it in the same way you can put a frog on a table and look at it. But if we're not going to treat consciousness as one big scary mystery, how do we treat it? How do we divvy it up into different properties? And there are many ways to do this. My preferred way is in terms of three basic features of consciousness: conscious level, how conscious you are. This is broadly the difference between being in a dreamless sleep or under anesthesia and being awake and aware, as we all are now. Conscious content: when you are conscious, you're conscious of something. The people, places, and objects that populate are conscious seen at any one time. And then there's conscious self, the experience of being an individual in the world, of being you. Now, I'm not going to talk about level today, but I'm going to talk about content and a little bit about self in the 15 minutes I have left. So there's one animating idea that I think is very useful to understand why our experiences of the world and of the self are the way they are. And this is the idea that the brain is a prediction machine, and that what we see, hear, and feel are and nothing other than the brain's best guesses about the causes of its sensory inputs. Century of the 20th century, we come up with this idea of perception as inference. And understand this, just change perspective for a bit and imagine that you are your brain. And there you are, you're stuck inside a bony skull trying to figure out what's out there in the world. Now, there's no light in the skull, there's no sound. All you've got to go on as a brain are streams of electrical signals which are only indirectly related to what's out there in the world, whatever that might be. So perception, this process of figuring out what's there, has to be a process of informed guesswork in which ambiguous sensory signals are combined with the brain's prior expectations or beliefs about the way the world is to form the brain's best guess of the causes of these signals. The brain doesn't see light or hear sound. What we perceive is the brain's best guess of what's out there. Let me give you a couple of examples to show at least how this works a little bit in practice. And you may have seen this illusion before. I can't see any faces, but maybe you'll have seen this before. This is Adelson's checkerboard. And in this illusion, there are two patches, A and B, and hopefully they look to be different shades of grey, with B looking lighter. Now, it's an illusion. Of course, they're exactly the same shade of grey. And I can show you that if I just put another version up with the two patches joined together. And you can see it's one continuous shade of grey. Just to show I'm not messing around, I can move that bar across and you can see now it really is a single continuous shade of grey. But take it away and they look different again. So what's happening here? Well, what's happening here is that the brain is using its prior knowledge encoded into the circuitry of the visual cortex, knowledge that you may not be aware that your brain has, that objects under shadow appear darker than they are. And so we see the patch B as lighter than it really is. And this underlines the point that vision isn't supposed to be a camera. It's not supposed to sort of be a light meter. It's supposed to infer what's out there in the world on the basis of ambiguous data. So we see B as lighter than it really is.
I think by virtue of the way we've defined the physical, consciousness is not physical by definition, and worse yet, it cannot even be reduced to the physical. And of course, there is nothing about these abstract quantities in terms of which we could deduce the quality of seeing a red apple or tasting the apple, or the quality of feeling a bellyache or falling in love. So by definition, we've turned these two domains into incommensurable domains. One is a given experience, the qualities of our inner life, and the other is a conceptual creation, the physical world. It is obvious that there is a world out there, independent of my mind, your mind, anybody's mind. There is a world out there that has an autonomous, independent existence. It exists in and of itself. So it's outside our individual personal minds. I think the objective world out there exists, but it is constituted by transpersonal mental states, which present to us in the form we call physicality, just as my phenomenal inner life presents itself to you in the form of the matter that constitutes my